QGIS is free open source software, which means anybody can download it and use it, which is pretty incredible because it's really powerful piece of software. The only other piece of software that's sort of comparable out there is a program called ArcGIS, which costs like $10,000. We used to use it in the newsroom, and if you take like GIS classes at the university, that's what they'll teach you. But QGIS is sort of the free open source version of that, and it's just really incredibly powerful. It used to be really difficult or fairly difficult to install. You had to do like command line stuff, but these days they've made it just a regular software package that you can download and install right on your computer. So let me go ahead and share screen for you guys. Make sure I got the right one. Okay, can you guys see my screen now? Great, okay. So this is the interface for QGIS right here on the screen. And this is a complicated software program. The best way to learn most complicated software programs, but certainly this program is to just learn how to do a few things and do a lot of Googling when you need to learn how to do something new. So everything I'm going to show you guys today is stuff, that I've hard-earned knowledge that I've learned through hours and hours of Googling for the most part. So what we'll do today is we'll just make like a simple choropleth map, and I'll just show you guys what like a 3D map might look like. So, the first thing that you often want to do in QGIS is to add a few things, which I'll show you guys how to do in a second. But this is the basic interface. We've got some drop downs up the top where you can open and close and save things. You'll end up using a lot of plugins in QGIS, which I think is sort of the result of it being open source, that people are constantly building new tools that you add in to extend it. Map shapes tend to either be vector, which means they're made of lines, or raster, which means they're made of dots. And we have lots of tools for our different vector and raster shapes. You can bring in different database stuff. And what we'll use a lot is our toolbox here, which you can actually see I've got the toolbox open over here, which just like includes probably thousands of different tools to do different operations in QGIS. Certainly hundreds, if not thousands. Up here we've got quick tools, and as you download plugins, you'll have more quick tools that like appear. These are a lot of my plugins over here. Where we'll mostly be working is over here in the left. So this is our browser into our computer where we can open up our different files and bring in our different layers and shapes. And down here, as we bring in layers, we'll see them appear down here, and we'll be able to mess with them and open them. So, one thing that you generally want to do pretty much right away is to add what they call XYZ tiles to QGIS, and that's going to, for the most part, just means different Google Maps and OpenStreetMap layers. And I have a link, which I'll share with you guys, that shows how to add different XYZ tiles. This is what I used. It literally just sort of walks you through the process. It's just a matter of adding in a URL in here, and then it'll add in those XYZ tiles. But you can see once you have those, you can add in a Google Roads layer or a Google Satellite layer. This will be a lot more useful once we actually have some other data on here sort of overlaid over top of it. Okay, so I'm just going to get rid of those. Just delete those layers. And a lot of what I'm doing is I'm just right-clicking on the layers. When you see this little menu pop up, it's just because I've right-clicked on it. So the other thing I wanted to talk about before we really get started is different types of geospatial files, because that can be really confusing when you first start working with a GIS software program. So there's lots of different sort of geospatial files that you can use to create maps. The most common type, so these are all vector GIS formats. The most common type is a shapefile, .shp usually. It oftentimes comes as a zip file or as a whole folder. But it's comprised of a couple different types of files, and the SHP, or the shape file, is the main geometry file. These aren't really files you can view anywhere outside of a GIS program, so you download them and then you sort of put them into the GIS program. Some other types are GeoJSON, which works really well, especially online, GML, KML, GPX, etc. There's a number of them, but you'll as you start playing around with GIS software, you'll get a little bit more familiar with these file types, but it can be a little bit confusing at first. But by far and away, the most common type is this shapefile, and that's what we'll be dealing with for the most part today. And I'll also share this in our Slack channel later on. So the question is, how do you get geospatial files? And they're out there. You'll be surprised at how sort of readily available they tend to be once you start looking. So a lot of times you find them through Google, right? Oftentimes governments put out geospatial files through their open data portals or their GIS agencies. So as you try to do maps about Maryland or Baltimore City, for instance, you're going to find lots of shapefiles that have been put out there by different government agencies in Maryland or at the national level or at the city level that you'd be able to use in your mapping. Sometimes you'll find some open source efforts to do some mapping that you can use for GIS efforts. And then sometimes you can just request them. I'll tell you that Maryland in particular, I've had great luck reaching out to their Department of Planning and just asking, hey, do you have they have one woman there who's sort of their, handles their GIS requests. And I've always found her to be very accommodating when I've requested stuff, and she usually gets back to me in a couple of days and just sends me, if they have it, whatever shapefile it is that I'm looking for. So, just like a lot of data that we use as journalists, you get it through requests. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's make a choropleth map. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in a shapefile. So I have, let's see, I have this folder here that I got from a Baltimore nonprofit called, it's like a Baltimore Neighborhoods Group, BNIJ, I think it is, and they have what they call their vital signs, and it brings in some census demographics and overlays it with Baltimore neighborhoods. So this is basically going to give us a map of Baltimore with all of the Baltimore neighborhoods, what they call CSAs, which are community statistical areas, broken out. They're sort of like collections of neighborhoods. There's about 120 of them, I believe. So anyway, this came as a zip file. I unzipped it, and I'm just going to drag this folder right into QGIS. And what happened is it popped up some stuff here. It's trying to figure out how to interpret it, what CRS to use, which we're not going to get too much into today. So I'll just hit OK, and there we go. There's Baltimore City broken out into the community statistical areas. So that's great. We've got this map of the city sort of brought in here, which is really, really useful. So we see our layer down here, and we can right click on it. We can do a few things. First thing we can do is we can open attribute table, which will show us, really this is the data. It shows us, okay, here are our CSAs. These are the neighborhood names, Cherry Hill, Clifton Berea, Cross Country, Downtown, etc. And then it'll show us like what the different fields are called in their database. And I don't have a data map for this, so I'm not totally sure what all of these mean, but they're basically just different census data. I can guess, the percentage of males, percentage of females. I believe there's some age and demographic information, just stuff that they brought in from the census. So another thing that we'll end up doing a lot is we'll end up opening up this properties panel, which here's where we'll do a lot of our work today. So this is going to show us, the symbology tab is where we'll create our choropleth map here in a couple minutes. You can see right now it's just filled with like an orange, and we can change that to some other color if we want. When you change something in QGIS, you always have to hit apply, and it'll just change it. But anyway, we'll come back and do some more work here in just a second. There's lots of stuff here that we can play with, 3D labels. There's some styling and legend stuff. There's this, oops. There are these fields here, which is really useful. And again, we'll be looking at this again in a second. But this basically shows you the structure of your data. So this is like each of the columns in our database, right? And it just lets us look at what we have in the data. So this is each column, and this is how the column is structured, which will be useful, as you guys will see in a minute. We can do joins between data sets, again, which will be really useful, and we will do in just a second. Okay, so I'm going to create just like a really basic choropleth map, just using the data that's already in this shapefile. So this is like, if I can just pause for a second, I'll show you guys, you know, in, see if I can find the Code Red project here. Okay, so if we look at heat and health, actually I think it's going to be inequality in health. So these these choropleth maps here are exactly, this is what we're going to be making basically today. So this looks at temperature, median afternoon temperature on a hot summer day in Baltimore, and then we overlaid that, you know, did the same type of maps looking at some different quality of life factors like poverty, lifespan, crime, and unemployment. So that's exactly the type of thing we're going to be making here. Okay, so we go up to symbology, and right now it's one single symbol. We want to change that to graduated. And now under value, we can choose one of our database columns for what it is that we want to visualize here, right? So these are the same columns that we've been looking at in the database. We can look at female or male, or we can look at age group, and again, we'd want a data dictionary so we understand exactly what these mean. But we'll just choose female for now, and we'll. So the first thing we do is we click classify, which, as you can see, is then breaking down all the values in classify into some buckets, right? I'm sorry, in female 10 into some buckets. So it basically takes the low value and the high value, and then it breaks it down into 5 different buckets, and we can change that number if we wanted to down here. 5 different classes equal count. And so now I just click apply, and there we go. We've created our choropleth map, and we can see the areas of Baltimore that are have a higher concentration of females. And this isn't compared to males. I think this is just like compared to each other. And we'll see that, you know, in general, more people live like in the darker areas, which I think is why we see certain areas as darker. So we could go up and we could change that, right? We could look at, let's say we wanted to look at like where all the young people live in Baltimore, right? So ages 5 to 17, where are the areas of Baltimore that have the most people under 18 years old, right? So now we click classify again, and it's going to create some new buckets for us. And we want to change the color ramp this time. Let's do it in blues instead.
I have a question, actually.
Yeah, what's up?
If you wanted to see like more of the shades of gray, as it were, how would you? Because it just looks kind of, you know, they're kind of like it's like white and then maybe like a slight shade of pink and then red. Is there like?
Yeah, so what you would do then is you could like increase the number of buckets basically that you're doing, right? So like we could take it up to 13 and then classify. Now we're going to get like a more granular view. And so you could just keep going with that. And you can change these colors too, like if you really wanted to you know, you could make the colors whatever you wanted. You wouldn't even have to have it be like, obviously, like visually it makes sense to have it graduated like this. But if you wanted to get really granular and make the bottom ones purple and the top ones green, you know, you could change this however you wanted to, if that makes sense. Does that answer it, Eric?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome,
thank
good. Yeah, so that's like how we make a basic choropleth map. You know, the problem is that, you know, this is just the data that came with our shapefile, and generally, like, your shapefile is just going to be geographic data. So it's not super useful to just be able to do this from one data layer. What's really helpful is if you can add in some new layers down here and then join them together and do your visualization that way. And so let's just look at how to do that real quick. So I have some demographic information, some data here that we'll just look at in Excel real quick. So this has all kinds of different information that we collected for that Code Red project. And a lot of it has to do with temperature, but so, I mean, first of all, we can see it's got, most importantly, it also is broken down by CSA, that community statistical area, right? So this is the place where we can do our join, right? We can join the data from here with the data from the map by the CSA column. That's really important, because if they didn't have a common column, we couldn't put the data together and visualize it, right? But this has got all kinds of information about temperature, and then it's got the same demographic information that we just saw in the data a second ago, but then it's got all this quality of life information about, we've got racial information, and I think it's got information about residential property values, and I think if we kept going, it would have information about crime and everything else that we ended up using in that those maps I showed a second ago. Okay, so this is going to be a little bit more complicated, but not too bad. Excuse me. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is just drag this on over here. And so now we've got our layer here. It's nothing showing up because it's not a shapefile. But what we can do is we can open the attribute table, and we can see basically the same thing I just showed you guys a second ago. So let's go to properties, and there's something I want to show you guys. So I could do my join now, but the problem is we wouldn't be able to visualize any of these factors because all those numbers right now are being brought in as strings instead of actually as numbers. And that becomes a big thing when you start working with data, as some of you guys who have taken the data class probably know. String is basically just like a bunch of characters, right? So it doesn't necessarily need to be a number, but for QGIS to be able to interpret this as a number, which it needs to do to be able to put things in buckets and visualize it, it needs to be an integer or a number, right? And if we open up the other data, we can see here, right, all of these are what are called doubles, which is sort of a type of integer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a tool that changes those fields in the other database into integers, and I'm going to actually just make sure it's exactly the same as, since these are working, I'm going to change them into exactly what these are, which is called double, and it's got the length of 23 and the precision of 15, which doesn't really matter if we understand exactly what that means, because we just know that we need to convert our data over to that format, which we can do pretty easily. So what we're going to do is come over here to our toolbox. So I got to that just by going down to toolbox, and there's a million different tools here for all different types of things, that you'll end up using for different stuff, and as you do different operations in QGIS. What we're going to do right now, we're looking for something called refractor fields. So I can just search for that, refactor fields. Okay, so I'm just going to click that open. These GIS programs take a tremendous amount of processing, so your computer will run pretty slow when you're doing it. Okay, so this is, it wants me to pick my input layer, which this is the right one. It's that demographics layer. And so, we would have to individually change each of the fields that we wanted to by hand here to refactor them. I'm just going to do one or two just to sort of show you guys how it works for the sake of time. So let's do median temp afternoon, which is the temperature that we ended up using for our heat map, our heat maps in Code Red. So I'm going to change that. So you can see right now it's just a text string. I'm going to go ahead and change that to decimal number, which they call double. And I'm going to give the length 23 and the precision 15. Maybe we'll just do, we'll do one more just so we can see. Okay, so I'm just going to run this now. I just click run, and then QGIS, executes that operation. And I can close it, and we can see we have a new layer over here where instead of refactoring the original layer, it creates a new layer called Refactored, which we could rename if we wanted to. If we ended up refactoring like a lot of different layers, we might want to rename it. For our purposes here, we can just stick with that. Okay, so now our next step is we need to join these two layers together. So we'll go back to our map layer and we'll go to properties and we will go to joins. And now we want to create a new join by clicking that plus. So it says, you know, what's the first layer? And we will select that refactored. And then what's our, so what's the join layer, right? Okay, so I'm just going to close this here. So you can see we're hovering over our vital signs layer, which is our map layer. So it knows that's what we want to join with. So it's basically saying, what layer do you want to join with? So we want to do refactored. And then what are the two fields called, right? So it's CSA 2010 and CSA 2010. So those are the two columns in our two data sets that match, where they're going to smush these two data sets together based on that column, right? And we just hit OK, and we will click Apply. And let's see if it worked. Yes, so you can see now when we look at our fields, it's showing us a bunch of new fields, which are the new additional fields that it added to this data, the refactored fields. All right, awesome. So now if we go up to our symbology layer, when we click down the value, we should be able to find those additional ones. Here we go. So these are the two that we converted in our refactoring fields to be integers instead of strings. So we can choose that temp, medium, afternoon. We can classify by that. Since we're dealing with temperature, why don't we make it like a red? And we will hit apply. Okay. And so now we were able to actually, instead of just visualizing the data that was originally in our shapefile, we were able to bring in a whole new data set, join that to the shapefile, and then visualize that. Okay, so I know that's a lot. I admit every time I do anything in QGIS, I have to refer to my notes. I have a big document that's like QGIS notes where I just write down everything that I learn with links and stuff. And I certainly practiced this yesterday to get ready for you guys. So this video will be available to you. And I'll share a couple links with you later. A couple real quick last things I want to show. So, you know, there's not a lot we can do with this in QGIS, right? So what you want to do is you can export it. So we can export it as an image or as a PDF right from here, which is useful. You can also export it as a SVG, which would let us bring it into Illustrator to basically do like whatever we wanted. So if we go to make a new print layout, as they call it, and I'll just call this SVG, and that'll pop open this this right here, where now we can add our map to this canvas. And now it has lots more options for saving as. Like I can export as SVG. So it's telling me, hey, we don't do a great job exporting it as SVG, which, okay, we'll still give it a shot. And I'll save this as SVG test on my desktop. Just hit OK. Now if we open that, in Illustrator, and this is how like these QGIS or these GIS programs are apps. They're not design tools, right? They're cartography tools, right? So now that I have this in Illustrator, as you guys have seen with our Illustrator infographics, I can ungroup these objects, and now I've got my individual neighborhoods. I can make this look however I want, right? So this is where I'm really going to go through another step and do design work to make these maps actually look nice and sort of match whatever style I have in my brain. So that's how to make choropleth maps. I wanted to show you just real quick what QGIS has some new functionality. Let me close this. That lets you do 3D mapping, which is really cool. We did it a year or two ago, looking at building heights in Washington, D.C., which is really fascinating work. But basically, you deal with some different file types because not only do you have to have, your flat geography, you have to have an additional sort of height measure in your geography. Um, this might take a moment to load. This GIS stuff takes so much computer processing, but it's really fascinating if we can get it to load. All right, I'm gonna close this down and just see if I can. All right, let's try it again. There we go. Okay, so what we have down here is the map layers that I built. I've got this one layer that's just this is just the sort of height data, the geographical data. This is central Colorado, which is like a good place to look at height because there's lots of mountains, right? You can really see it. And then I just overlaid or really underlaid some Google satellite data on it. And then what we have up here is the actual 3D view. We can see, we can sort of move it around and zoom in on it, and we can actually see what, in 3D, what this area of Colorado looks like. And when we were doing this with Washington, D.C., it was really cool because you got to see all the buildings, looking at building size and hills, and of course there were big like splotches taken out of it for the White House and etc. But this can be really, really fun for visualizing journalism purposes too, right? Because we could make like a 3D map like this, like let's say an avalanche happened or some sort of accident happened in the mountains. We could output a 3D map like this and then bring this into Illustrator and start showing, okay, well this happened here and this happened here and then this is where this happened. And there's even a program that I have that I played around with, a plugin called QGIS 23JS that lets you do like interactive versions of these 3D maps. So anyway, lots of fun stuff to play with in QGIS.